Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Let's talk about Surah 5, verse 33. It's a verse that is often quoted by the extremists as well as the non-Muslims preaching against the Quranic message, and they quote this verse in an attempt to show how the Quran teaches and justifies violence. The verse reads, إنما جزاء الذين يحاربون الله ورسوله ويسعون في الأرض فسادا أن يقتلوا أو يصلبوا أو تقطع أيديهم وأرجلهم من خلاف أو ينفوا من الأرض ذلك لهم خزي في الدنيا ولهم في الآخرة عذاب عظيم. Translation: the recompense of those who wage war against God and His Messenger and strive to corrupting the land, they are to be killed or crucified or their hands and feet cut off on alternate sides, or they are to be banished from the land. That for them is a humiliation in this world, and the hereafter they will have a great retribution. Now, reading this verse prematurely is a consequence of the extremists as well as the non-Muslims preaching against the Quranic message. I say prematurely because oftentimes they'll quote these types of verses through the filter of the hadith, as well as lacking the context, as well as lacking the ability to examine key terms that are being used in the verse. So let's take this from the very top. Before talking about 533, allow me to share with you two important things. The first thing is that when it comes to violence, the Quran teaches us that violence is allowed only under self-defense. Surah 2 verse 190 reads, "You shall fight in the cause of God those who fight you, and do not aggress, for God does not love the aggressors." This verse is crystal clear that violence is allowed only if someone is attacking you, and we are not allowed to initiate any form of aggression. The second thing is the Quran does condone capital punishment. If a person deliberately and maliciously kills another person, the maximum penalty for that person can be death. Surah 2, verse 170. So these two verses show us that the Quran is establishing for us a justice system. And 533 is part of this justice system. In fact, if you read 533, the verses before 533, we will see that God is talking about the very first murder on earth, the murder case on earth, which is between Adam's two sons, right? And then the next verse, verse 32, talks about how because of that murder, that first murder, God says that if you killed a person, it's as if you killed the entire humanity, and that the opposite is true. Then 533 comes into play. So the context is vital here. Now, let's talk about specifically what is mentioned in 533. This verse talks about fulfilling three criterias. The person or the group must fulfill three criterias in order for this verse to be applicable. The three criterias are to wage war against God, His messenger, and to strive in corrupting the land. All three of these criteria must be met. You can't have one or two. All three must be met. Okay, so let's talk about each of these criteria. The first one is to wage war against God. Now, question for you: how do you wage war against God? Remember, the Quran teaches us that God is no thing. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is no thing like Him. Okay? So God is not a thing that we're going to wage a physical war against. Rather, the Quran teaches us that God is the peace. He is the justice, the mercy, the compassion, the security, and so forth. This is what God is. And so, or the attributes of God, I should say. And when you wage war against God, you are waging war against these things, against peace, justice, mercy, compassion, and so forth. This is what you're waging war against. Okay, so that's the first criteria. The second criteria is to wage war against His messenger. And that ultimately goes hand in hand with the first criteria, because the word messenger is being used, Rasul. Okay, Rasulahu is being used in this verse. Rasulahu emphasizes and points to the actual message, the person carrying the actual message. And it's not exclusive to Prophet Muhammad, it's to all of God's messengers. And this is because the messenger is the one who is preaching the message of peace and justice and mercy and compassion and security and so forth. So the first two criteria refer to waging war against peace and justice, mercy, compassion, security, and so forth. These types of things. Now, the third criteria is to strive in corrupting the land. Okay? The Arabic word yas'auna means to be active in striving in something. Okay? The Arabic word fasad, corruption. The opposite of fasad in the Quran is islah. Islah means to fix something, whereas fasad is to corrupt or dismantle or to ruin something. So when you look at all three of these criteria, they ultimately go hand in hand. They intertwine, so to speak, because once you disrupt the peace and justice and mercy and security, you are creating this corruption. You are dismantling an entire society. To cut it short, these three criteria are referring to any form of tyranny, any tyrant creating oppression, apartheid, or any form of oppression or war. This is what this verse is talking about. Think of someone like Hitler, for example, okay? So this is what this verse is talking about. Unfortunately, some YouTubers and street preachers think that 533 applies to them because they are talking negatively about the Quran. Sorry, this is not about you. This verse is definitely not about you or anything like anything similar to you. This verse is talking about something at a much, much, much wider scale. We are talking about absolute corruption, oppression, apartheid, genocide, all forms of oppression, any form of tyranny as well. This is what this verse is talking about. Okay, it's not talking about some petty things like preaching against the Quranic message. Okay, so as I mentioned, 533 is establishing a justice system. It's telling us that a tyrant is to be killed or crucified or banished from the land. This is what this verse is talking about. God is issuing an absolute warning towards these types of people or even groups. Okay, this is what this verse is talking about. Now, the second part of this verse says this type of the killing and the crucifying and so forth, this is a humiliation for them in this life, and in the hereafter they will have a great retribution. Now what's interesting is the next verse, verse 34. It says, except for those who repent before you overtake them, then know that God is forgiving. I need to emphasize here, this verse isn't saying to forgive the tyrant. No, this verse is telling us that God is the one who may forgive them in the hereafter. In other words, if, for example, Hitler, if he was overtaken, then the 533 applies to him. They are to be killed or crucified, or their hands and feet cut off on an alternate side, or they're to be banished from the land. That is what we as humans in this world must do, okay? Then the verse says, except for those who repent before you overtake them. So if Hitler repented to God before he was overtaken, then God may forgive him in the hereafter. Okay, so this is what this verse is talking about. Again, we are taking the entire passage in its contextual analysis and studied some key terms that are used in this verse, and we see that this is talking about something much wider than a simple street preacher. Okay, I hope this has helped you understand what 533 is about. Wassalamu alaikum.